Tuia te hā, tuia te kupu, tuia te kōrero, tau te māramatanga, tihei Māori ora. Kia ora koutou, no mai haere mai, ko Neil Atkinson tōku ingoa. I'm the Chief Historian at Manatū Taonga, Ministry for Culture and Heritage, and delighted to welcome people here today at the National Library Auditorium and those joining us online. To welcome you to today's talk on the craft of historical storytelling in podcasts. As we will all know, in recent years, the podcast in its many diverse forms has become a hugely popular way for people to consume and engage with content and stories of all kinds, including Aotearoa New Zealand's history and heritage. And today, we're very lucky to be joined by two leading podcast producers, William Ray and Kirsten Johnstone, who will explore the art of creating captivating history podcasts, the delicate balance of distilling complex history for an engaging auditory experience, using sound design and music to enhance storytelling and offer insider tips and tricks from their work. After honing her craft as a producer, editor, host, and content creator at Radio New Zealand, Kirsten Johnstone, Ngāi Tahu Pākehā, co-founded the production company Popsock Media in 2020, and has produced award-winning podcasts such as The Lake, The Magpie House, and Te Rauparaha ki Wareware. William Ray is also an award-winning podcast producer who primarily works on history programming at Radio New Zealand, including the popular Black Sheep and the Aotearoa History Show. So I'm going to hand over to William and Kirsten, who have got a little double act lined up. So please join me in welcoming them.
Tēnā koutou katoa, no kōterana, airana, ingirani, rakiura me whenua hou oku tūpuna. Ko Ngāi Tahu ka te mamoe me waitaha oku iwi, ko Kirsten Johnstone tōku ingoa. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. I'm a podcast producer. Some of you may know my name and voice from RNZ, where I worked for a good 15 or 16 years as a music journalist. But for the past 5 years, I co-run a Wellington-based podcast production company called Popsock Media, alongside Melody Thomas, another RNZ refugee. Our very first series together was literally recorded in my daughter's bedroom cupboard, which we adorned with duvets. We've gotten a little bit more professional since then. Although we did win an award and the judges said that it commended our production quality for that podcast. We collaborate on podcasts that vary a lot in subject, from institutional abuse to how to have good sex and relationships, from mātauranga Māori climate action to New Zealand's justice system, from Te Rauparaha to Lilburn. But what a lot of the series we've worked on have in common is that they have historical aspects to them. And as my collaborators might attest to, I love a dusty old filing box or archival recordings where the voices are nice and BBC proper, or those pristine brown envelopes they give you upstairs at the Alexander Turnbull Library. The historical research is one of my favourite parts of the job, so I'm a little bit of a history nerd, but not quite so much as my friend William here.
Kia ora koutou. Ko ngarangi te whakapaparanga mai, ko kirikiri roa te whenua tūpū, kei pōneke ahau e noho ana, hei kai whakaputa o kōnai ipurangi ahau, ki te reo irirangi o Aotearoa, ko William Ray tōku ingoa, kia ora. So I'm William Ray. I'm a senior podcast producer at RNZ, and I've been doing that job for about 10 years, and the entire time I've been focused primarily on making content about Aotearoa New Zealand history. One thing I often get asked is whether I studied history at university or at school. The answer to both of those questions is no. I often give the anecdote that I came out of high school, and I won't disclose which high school I went to, believing that Te Tiriti o Waitangi was signed at the conclusion of the New Zealand Wars to end those wars, which is absolutely incorrect and probably goes to a bit of the state of history education in New Zealand at the time. Hopefully it's a little bit better now. So I came to an interest in history in my sort of early 20s at university when I started consuming podcast and YouTube content about history overseas. And I thought to myself, this is awesome. I love listening to this stuff, but there's nothing here about New Zealand. And anytime I looked up New Zealand history on YouTube, it was generally misinformation. So I got chatting with a friend of a producer friend of mine, that was Mark Darby, and together workshopped the idea of creating Black Sheep, which we then pitched to RNZ, which was creating its podcast unit at the time. And the rest has been history. Since then, I've worked on all kinds of history projects, continued to work on Black Sheep. We made the Aotearoa History Show with a lot of help from Neil, actually fact-checking us along the way. That's got into New Zealand schools, which has been really cool, although the terrifying bit has been that new interns at RNZ come up to me now and say, "Oh, hi, I watched your videos when I was at school," and that makes me feel really old. So yeah, worked on lots of sort of history adjacent podcasts too, including Nellie's Baby, Untold Pacific History, the New Zealand Wars series. Currently working on one called Kelly Tarleton's Final Treasure Hunt, which I was rudely awakened this morning by a bunch of text informing me that Kelly Tarleton's old Museum of Shipwrecks burned down last night. And we are due to record a script today, which I've been hurriedly rewriting to include that fact. So, you know, history is always an evolving thing. Yeah, Kirsten.
History podcasts are popular. I mean, Will's Black Sheep and Aotearoa History Show audience numbers are pretty impressive. The Rest is History is consistently in the top 10 on Apple Podcasts. Dan Carlin's Marathon Hardcore History, which I think you were a fan of, Will, it has a hardcore fan base. You're Dead to Me brings comedy to serious history and again often ends up in that top 10. Malcolm Gladwell's Revisionist History is one of my favorite podcasts. But a lot of these shows are straight essay or chat format, which is not really what me and Will love to do. You want to talk about the style that we do, Will?
Yeah, so the fancy name for what we do is long form narrative nonfiction, which I got from a book about podcasting. I think probably what we would know it better as is a documentary style podcasting. So it's podcasting where you're linking together script, archival material, first-hand accounts with voice actors, interview audio, of course, and we're all weaving it together with music and sound effects and making what we hope will be a really engaging project. I lack both the skill and the sort of knowledge to talk off the cuff about history like this. So scripts are great. Scripts and experts to talk to are the name of the game, definitely for me, and I think probably for you as well. Yeah.
Do you want to talk about reasons why we like listening?
So I'm aware we're in a library at the moment, but books are really long and hard to read. And so our target audience for podcasts are people who would probably not pick up the books of the people who we're interviewing. They're people who may have an interest in history, who may not even know they have an interest in history until they start listening to these things. And the advantages from our end are making podcasts is cheap, relatively speaking. You don't have anything with cameras is fiendishly difficult and expensive to do, as we found out when we made the Aotearoa History Show, and that was a YouTube series which didn't need proper production quality. That was I had no idea how difficult anything involving cameras was until we started doing that. They're also just in your ear when you're doing other stuff. You can't read a book while you're driving. You can't read a book in the shower, although I did try in my teenage years. And you can speak directly into your audience's brain. You are right there in their ears. It's an incredibly intimate experience, and it develops a lot of trust with your audience. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, great podcasts are really impactful. And as an example, in 2021, we jumped in the deep end with Aaron Smale here, who's sitting in the middle of the audience, doing a podcast, a 7-part series called The Lake, about the children who went through Lake Alice Psychiatric Hospital in the 1970s. And I think for me, learning that history was a little bit radicalizing. I'd spent a couple of years growing up in Wanganui at the time Lake Alice was being shut down. I was aware that there were some horrendous things that had happened there. I knew it was a place that junkies in our town went to rummage through abandoned medical cabinets, and that I had a couple of friends whose parents had been inpatients at one time. I also knew that in 2020 there was an inquiry into abuse in state care, but I didn't really know what that was about. It was kind of a nebulous concept to me until I started digging into the story alongside Aaron. And that made me really understand how the children who ended up in Lake Alice were part of a system of colonization that took Māori kids from their homes for decades, placed in institutions like Wairaka, Kohiteri and Lake Alice. They didn't get much of an education, but they did learn how to spot a pedophile, how to fight and how to run away. And following the life stories we collected of Rangi, Tyrone, Vernon, Leone, and the others, from foster homes to those institutions, to prisons, to addiction issues, to living on the streets, to just trying to piece together, some kind of normal functioning life, personalizing it with those characters who we got to know really well, joined the dots for me between colonization and the negative stats for Māori, and made me much more conscious of the inherent racism built into our systems and institutions. It made me really keen to keep telling those stories that shone a light on it. And although Aaron had been writing stories in major publications about survivors in state care for a good few years by then, I think he was floored by the response to the lake, not least from some of the people who were actually in it. I'm not going to say it, Aaron. But I think it's reaching those audiences that wouldn't pick up a history book. And as Will said, part of it is the intimacy of that medium. If they're done right, you can build a real sense of the character of the people speaking. In the case of the lake, we hear Rangi and Tyrone's pitch black humour, which is part of their coping mechanism, and that playful relationship that they'd had since they were kids come through. They're stoic survivors, but they're still little boys in there somewhere. And it's their history and their words. And I think that's part of the magic of oral history and, this oral medium, the podcasts. When I said their story, their words, it's not entirely true. It's mediated by us as editors, though, of course, in an ethical and objective way. And we'll talk a little bit more about that editing process soon. So what makes a good history podcast subject? Maybe Will, you can take over that one.
Oh, it's such a tricky question. I don't really have a formula for it. It's like I just we get pitched ideas a lot, and sometimes you'll just see something, you'll leap off the page and go, that is amazing. I never knew that before. That's fascinating. There are some things which can be like, even though it's a great idea, you hear it, it's got a fantastic, beginning, middle, and end. The trick with history is always finding someone to talk to it. Quite often, quite often in history, the people directly involved are dead. Sometimes they did leave it behind their written words. Sometimes they didn't. Sometimes people wrote about them at the time. Sometimes you have only one person who could really speak to that event, and they just don't want to talk to you for whatever reason. And that is always the biggest, hardest part of producing a history podcast. I think for me, it probably consumes about 60 to 70% of production time is finding the people to talk to. Sometimes it's really easy. Sometimes it's really hard. Sometimes you have people who say no, and then they come back a week later and say, oh, actually, yeah, all right, fine. As I've found in, we've been working on this Kelly Tarleton project recently, sometimes what can happen is they start hearing the podcast go out and they go, oh, so that's really coming out, is it? Actually, I might talk to you after all. And you go, you evil so-and-so, why didn't you not come back to me earlier? And now I have to completely rewrite my script. So there's always an element of building the plane while it's in the air. But yeah, it's a tricky question to answer. I don't know if you have any additional thoughts on that one.
Well, like any good story, it needs some drama, action, high stakes, maybe some great characters and relationships, and maybe something we can learn from. It could have a contemporary resonance. I know that when you're pitching to media organizations, a bonus is if it has a newsy angle, something quite current, like, I don't know, a shipwreck museum being burnt down. You did that on purpose.
We didn't do it. We didn't do it.
But sometimes the podcast itself can be quite agenda setting. I mean, like in the case of Grove Road, which is a 2018 News Hub podcast about the murder of Arthur Easton. I think it was as a result of that podcast that went back to court. We do a lot of research before deciding to make a podcast about something, and you really do need to have your audience in mind. First and foremost, who is this podcast for? Who's going to listen to it? What do you want them to take away from it? And that'll inform, who you choose to tell the story, the host, the language of it, maybe the soundtrack, the style of it, the pace of it.
Yeah, one of the things which I've just seen in my notes here, which I missed, was something which gets banged into me all the time by my executive producer, who's Tim Watkin, which is subject versus story. We do not do podcasts about subjects. We do podcasts about stories. And just to give an example, we're currently working on a podcast about the Māori Wardens. Māori Wardens is a subject. You cannot do a podcast just about the Māori Wardens, partly because it's too big of a subject to do. That's all encompassing. What could it possibly be? And so what we've drilled down on is the co-host of this podcast, when he was 11 years old, was picked up on the side of the road by Māori Wardens while he was running away from home, and credits them with completely turning his life around. I mean, he sort of actually said in the production process that he'd listened to the lake, and he thought that if he had not been picked up by the Māori Wardens, he would have been picked up by the police, and probably his story would have gone down that sort of route. So that's the kind of thing I'm talking about. There needs to be a story. It needs to have a beginning, middle, and end. It can't just be, I don't know, the Māori Wardens, the Native Land Court. You can do podcasts about those things, but you have to find the storyline through it, something to drive the narrative forward. And that's been, I think, part of what's made Black Sheep work, is that quite often we're just picking some random, usually guy, who has played a central role in a big event, a big organization, a big movement through history, and we're using them as a in to get into that subject. Most of the podcast is not necessarily biography. It can be about that institution, that subject, but we're using them as a through line to tell that story. And obviously that's a narrative trick which people have been using since forever. It's not something I invented or that podcasts invented. Yeah.
And I think, to go back to Will's point about finding the right people, I mean, sometimes finding the right person can really give a podcast direction. In 2021, I produced a podcast called The Magpie House at the request of Diana Marsh, who was then head of sounds. And it took some pretty disparate stories, great stories, around a house at Ascot Street, just down the road, that Douglas Lilburn had lived at. And I had some pretty sleepless nights trying to think of the connectors between a Jewish refugee architect, a communist club who'd been spied on by the special branch of the police, and a groundbreaking composer. So when I found out that my old colleague, Nick Bollinger, was the grandson of a Jewish refugee singer and poet who had collaborated with Lilburn, the son of a communist who'd flattered with the special branch spy, had known Lilburn as a kid growing up in Thorndon, and of course he himself was a great music journalist, it all connected. Nick was the glue that really held that podcast together. And I think the lake worked partially because we had people in there whose stories hadn't been heard before. There were Pākehā survivors who had made a lot of noise and complaints over the years. People like Kevin Banks, who'd made complaints to police in the 90s, or Paul Zentfield, who went to the UN with accusations of torture. And we did speak to those guys. But it was really important to hear from the guys who hadn't been heard before publicly, as Aaron says, to give them the dignity of being heard. These were guys who weren't ready to speak before, for whatever reason. They'd joined gangs, they'd gone to prison, but now they were grandfathers and they had health issues and they wanted their story to be heard, wanted their descendants to hear their story. We also wanted heroes in that story because it is so bleak. And so planting, some of those people throughout that, I think really, Oliver Sutherland, a great anti-racism warrior, a group of Scientologists who were fighting against psychiatry, a teacher, Anna Natush, who just showed those boys some real care. Those bright lights in a very dark podcast can really take it out of that place.
So we should talk a bit about interviewing. There are a few people here who I've interviewed before, so I'm going to tell you what you did wrong. So when we're prepping for an interview, you need to be well researched. You need to know what you're going to ask about. Quite often people will ask for your questions in advance, and I resist trying to give those out, both because it's RNZ editorial policy and I'm not allowed to, and also because if people research their own answers to your interviews, it starts sounding really terrible. Ideally, you want your interviewee to talk in short sentences and never go on a tangent. That is not how people talk, unfortunately. Particular people who are getting on a bit, who are sometimes the subject of our interviews, who will sort of be starting to tell this great dramatic story about like, oh yeah, I was with Kelly when we went down on the Alingamide and we got to the bottom, and then, oh, and yeah, the thing about the boat was, and then you go, oh, please stop. But that is the beauty of long form narrative nonfiction, is you just edit them within an inch of their life until they say what you wanted them to say in the first place. There is a bit, I think, you may disagree with me on this, but I think a bit of a danger in being over-researched, because quite often what I find when I do interviews that I've been freaking out about and I've read all the books and everything is that I forget what I haven't asked about, because I'm not coming to it as a naive interviewer. I'm like, in my head, I already know the sequence of events. So I'm not doing, oh, so what happened then? Or, oh, you just said that. I don't quite understand that. Can you just explain? So coming to it with a bit of the naivety of your listener is actually quite helpful. And I actually think has been quite helpful in me being a history podcaster without any professional background in history, is I generally like to think that I know what kind of things my audience would like to know, because I also start off not knowing anything about the thing that I'm writing about. Yeah.
I, of course, over-prepare for absolutely everything. But I agree, coming in a little naive and asking those dumb questions is really important. But as anybody who interviews for a living will tell you, the most important thing to do in an interview is to listen. And one of the things I listen out for in interviews is those small moments of concrete action. Anywhere you might think there's a turning point in their story, or where they're recounting dialogue, or where they're physically doing something in the story. Sometimes they skim over those bits, but don't be afraid to bring them back into that moment again and again to get what you need there, to get those scenes.
And doing multiple interviews. Yeah, if you've got the capacity to do multiple interviews, that is fantastic, because then you listen back to your interview, you go, damn, I should have asked that. And you can come back to it. It's fantastic. So scripting and shaping is our next subject. So I'm going to talk more about, we're not going to sort of go into the nitty gritty of how to script, because that would be this entire talk and then another entire talk after that. There's tons of great guides on good writing online. I'm sure a lot of you know how to write very good stuff already. When I think about shaping a podcast, I always think about this clip of the author Kurt Vonnegut, which you can find it on YouTube if you want to. He's the author who wrote Cat's Cradle, and there was another one he was really famous for, which I'm blanking on. But anyway, he gives this great talk, and I'm going to plagiarize it for you now. He has a whiteboard, so I have a whiteboard too. So basically, if we think of a shape of a story in two axes, so we've got our y-axis, and we're going to think about this in terms of positive and negative energy. So sort of like good, boisterous, good health, as I think Kurt says, and sickness and despair and death down at the bottom. And then we have beginning to the end of our story. A typical shape of a story is someone starts off relatively normally, something terrible happens to them. Then they fix it. And that is a really satisfying shape to a story. I think Kurt calls it man falls into a hole. Man is going along, falls into a hole, gets out of it again. Great shape for a story. People's actual lives tend to look, I mean, depending on who the person is, but a lot of the time their life will look a bit like this. And if you do a podcast about them, maybe it might go like this. And the trick to doing a podcast, or it might, to be honest, it might be like this the whole way along. Or an event could be like that. It could just be terrible, awful, relentless, bad thing happening after bad thing. You cannot make podcasts that look like this. You will either depress your audience and they'll sort of be in floods of tears and go, I can't listen to episode 2, I can't bear it. Or they'll go, this is so boring. It's one note all the way through. And then right in the middle of your podcast, you had something exciting happening and then nothing happened for the rest of it. So what you need to do is often play with chronology. Quite often what I'll do with someone's life looks a bit like this. We take this bit and we put it here. We start in the middle, we start at the end. We shape the story around that because we know we're going to get to this later. We just spend the first 10 minutes talking about, first 5 minutes talking about it, and then we have the audience's permission to go down here in terms of energy for a bit because they know, well, we're going to get back up here eventually. They'll keep listening to you. And I always think when I'm trying to develop a script, where is my shape at? Have I left my audience too far down here? Have I been up here for too long? Have I just been playing? Because you can also exaggerate the shape of your curves using, music, sound effects, all kinds of things. You play a bit of sort of tense, dramatic, sad music that's going to pull your audience down. You play some triumphant music that's going to bring them up here. There's all kinds of little tricks and techniques that you can do to get an interesting shape to your story. And you just need to be conscious about where it is, even though you'll be very anxious, and I always am, to include every little detail of what has happened, because your interviewer is going to pick you up. They're going to be like, why didn't you talk about this? I spent 10 minutes explaining this to you. And if it doesn't serve the shape of the story, you just have to get rid of it. And in the game, I think that's called killing your babies.
Right.
Yeah.
Should we play an intro?
Yeah. So we'll play an intro to give an example of this. This is a part of the start of a series which I helped produce. It's called The Service, made by John Daniel and Guy Nespina.
The day I turned 10, my mother told me she had been a spy. Although she tells that story a bit differently now.
I wouldn't have actually said that, darling. I only think the ones who run around outside are the ones that, anyway.
You say, you didn't really do anything, but you had these little bits of tradecraft, how to tell a two-way mirror. You had clothes that were reversible.
Yes.
You had stories about, cameras, hidden cameras. You had stories.
Versus, that was the fun side. And you could, I was sent out. I had to do a stint with the technical people for a while. And I was sent out with this hideous plastic handbag, which you wouldn't have ever chosen for yourself, with a camera in it.
My name is John Daniel. My mum started working for New Zealand's Security Intelligence Service, the SIS, in the 1960s.
So yeah, we're starting there with a very fun anecdote, right? It's very up here. We're going to, if we had started with this podcast, we're like, this is a podcast about the Security Intelligence Service and what New Zealand does and doesn't do in terms of, it would be quite down here, or even worse, in the middle. So that's just an example of sort of starting at not necessarily the beginning of your story.
For the lake, we used a dramatic drop intro as well. It starts with the scene of a young man, gun in the boot of his car, returning to the place he suffered as a child, and he's intending to make someone pay. It builds that tension up with sound effects and music. It's only about a minute long. It doesn't matter that when we return to the scene within its chronology, a couple of episodes later in the series, we realize he actually doesn't end up finding anyone to kill. But as a counterpoint to the dramatic intro, we started Heaven's Helpline with a pretty benign but memorable little scene where a woman's recounting the education she got about sex in the Mormon church. A bishop's wife had brought in a beautiful white cake and thrown mud on it to illustrate what would happen if one sullied oneself. No one would want you. And it's just a little story, but as the podcast goes on, that lesson takes on a bigger significance. But then we also follow it up with a big forward sell of the whole series, all of its trauma and abuse. Often we have 2 or 3 intro pieces in the first episode of the series, and sometimes it's almost the last thing that we write in the entire series. The other thing to make sure of is that you use the best cliffhangers in the story at the end of episodes. I've got more of a forward sell to play you than a cliffhanger. This is from Heaven's Helpline. It's a series about the cover-up of abuse in the Mormon church. And we've just heard the harrowing case of domestic abuse from Caroline and of the Mormon church re-traumatizing the victim. And then this outro makes it clear that it's not a one-off case.
I wanted to understand more about how this could have happened. So I started asking people some different questions. Less about the church's incredible wealth or recruitment tactics, and more about how the church responds to people at their most vulnerable. And once I started looking for that kind of story, the cases came flooding in.
I really knew that it wasn't right. It was wrong. It had to
Sort of
stop.
warning bells for me that something's not quite
The
right.
church has admitted sexually abusing boys over several
Our
years.
daughter was just 2.5 when she was sexually abused by a man.
church elder who sexually
All we've done is we've moved him from one area to another.
So in short, we work really hard as producers and editors and writers to make sure that the listener comes with us, that you're not bored, and that you like, subscribe, and most importantly, press play on the next episode.
Yeah, I think there's some stat that, like, if you can get people to listen to the first, I think it's like not even 1 minute, maybe like first 40 seconds of episode 2, they are very likely to stay with you through the entire series. So it's really critical, particularly when you're making, ongoing multi-episode series like that, to drive the listener through each, particularly that first to second episode transition. Of course, between the middle and end, you have the middle, which is where most of your podcast goes. As with, writing anything, it's really important to break things up into digestible chunks. In a book, you do that with chapters. With podcasts, I guess you could do it with chapters as well if you really wanted to.
Use the word chapters, beats,
Yeah.
scenes.
Yeah. And often you're doing that through little audio cues. So that could be just like a little swell of music, could be some sound effects coming in and coming out, because you want to avoid being too, in your scripting, being too like, and then I talked to XYZ and he said something different. You want to avoid being too literal. You don't even have to introduce your talent straight away. You could have them talk for a good 2 minutes. And so long as you don't think the audience is going, who on earth is this person? I can't understand why they haven't introduced them. People will just stay with you for a little bit until you introduce who you're talking to. And it can be more powerful to have them come in cold. So just to give an example of that, we'll play a bit of the sort of, this is moving from the introduction of the podcast that I produced about Surfend for the Black Sheep series into sort of the guts of the podcast. And you'll sort of see, I've actually got a video of the editing program so you can sort of see actually what's being done, the transitions in music and sound effect to move between those different ideas.
In the months and years that followed, General Allenby did soften his tone somewhat. He praised the Anzacs for their service. But he never forgave or forgot what some of those troops did just after the war ended. A cold-blooded massacre at a place known as Surfield.
You know, for a sergeant to be killed like that, you know, and everyone is a bit head up with that sort of thing.
That's right. Yeah.
You know, they do things you wouldn't do normally in this.
No.
But they did. They went in there.
Yeah.
So yeah, you can see what we're doing there with sort of rise and fall of music, sound effects, things like that. We haven't introduced the person who's talking, but you can get the feeling that it's archival. You might get the idea that it's actually someone who's there, which I'm about to tell you in the next bit of script. But I don't have to tell you to start off with. You can rely on the audience having a bit of common sense, and that they will stay with you a bit through these projects. Yeah.
I think when you're making a podcast series, it can be quite overwhelming. At some point, you've collected all of these interviews. Some of them are 2 to 5 hours long, and you can really get lost at some point and overwhelmed. But one of the good things I think about making a historical podcast is that you do always have the chronology to fall back on. With the lake, we sometimes withheld things in the chronology, though, until the right time in the story when the audience was prepared to have that information. Episode 3 told the story of Halo, who was a boy who his case went through court in the 1970s, and there was a big media uproar about it. So for that episode, we told the listener what was heard in that courtroom and what was out there in the media at the time. But then we have another episode that comes after that, which expands on that story and really tells the full scope of what was going on at Lake Alice. You know, the sexual abuse, the use of paraldehyde as punishment, and the pitting of children against children. And it was only for those that had the stomach for that. As Will said, editing is super important. Killing your babies is one of the first things that I learned in radio. You very often have to cut material that doesn't serve the narrative. As part of the post-production process, we always have what's called a table read. It's kind of a dress rehearsal for the studio where the host reads the script, we play audio clips and run it for an audience, usually the executive producer. And this is often where we find the sections that drag, the boring bits, the jokes that fall flat. Those execs will let you know. Last year, I co-produced Heaven's Helpline, and the Mormon Church has an absolutely fascinating history in the US and here in Aotearoa. And host Murray Jones and co-writer Adam Dudding and I thought we'd done a really great job at condensing that down to a swift 25 minutes with sound effects, with music, with jokes. And we did this table read with hard-nosed NZME journalists and execs and really hoped that they liked it. And about 5 minutes into the history section, I saw their eyes glaze over, saw them check their phones, make a few notes, and I knew that that was it for the history section as a compromise, because we had put quite a bit of work into it. We split it out into an explainer episode, and I think it was worth doing. About 40,000 people downloaded that episode, so I'm glad we kept it.
So one of the things which can come up in history podcasting in particular is different versions of stories, contesting narratives. This is something we come across all the time. One particular example I think of is in the New Zealand Wars series, Stories of Tainui. So I'm not involved in the video side of that, but we present a companion podcast, which is sort of the idea is to, because they collect all these amazing interviews and then they could only use a tiny bit of them for the video version. So we expand into sort of sometimes multi-episode, multi-hour long things. And there was one particular part in that podcast which was a bit tricky, which was to do with a story of a meeting between King Pōtatou and Governor Grey, where it's a very famous story, I gather, within Tainui. I'm not a member of Tainui myself, so I can't speak for them, obviously, but that Governor Grey is sort of saying, where are you going to go? Where are you going to hide? And then they're saying back, we're going to hide in our forest. We'll be sustained by the forest, by the birds, all these sorts of things. And then Governor Grey says, oh, what about when all those things are gone, when we've pushed you out of the trees and cut them all down, what will you eat then? And then Pōtātou comes back and says, we will eat you. And it is a fantastic line, to the degree that when we had the public screening of it for Tainui, they all said it along with him as he said it. It was amazing. The problem is that there is, in the written source side of things, it seems like Governor Grey and Pōtātou Te Whetawhero were never in New Zealand at the same time in the time frame where that could actually have happened. So what do? You can't just throw out this amazing story, which is such a core part of the oral tradition. And you also, I don't think, can just have that story there with no explanation of what the written sources say. And I think it is okay to just sort of say, here is the oral tradition, here is what the written sources say. And quite often you can sort of, I think your listener gives you more credit for doing that. If you acknowledge, particularly if you acknowledge, I just don't know. You know, like even simple stuff, like for example, in that Surafend episode, there's a guy who's called Colonel AM. I could not find for the life of me what those initials stood for. And I just had to say in the podcast, this guy's Colonel AM, can't read his handwriting, don't know what his full name is, very sorry about that. And your audience kind of love you for doing that sort of thing. You're acknowledging that you're human with a bit of humor sometimes when appropriate, sometimes it's not. And there's just ways to get through it. And in podcasts, I think the benefit is that you have some time to do that. These are longer form things. You can work that out. Yeah.
Yeah, we had this numerous times when I was working with Ross Kalman and Imogen Kelly on Te Rauparaha ke Wareware. I mean, there's such mythology around Te Rauparaha. But as Rangitane historian Peter Meihana said to me with a sigh, this is the nature and beauty of Māori history. The puka puka that the podcast was based on was written by Tamihana, Te Rauparaha's son, in the 1860s. So there's implicit bias within that source material already. And then when we're speaking to descendants and Ngāti Toa kaumātua who had their own versions of the stories passed down through the generations. So we wanted to balance this by speaking to some of the descendants and historians of the enemy iwi, who have completely different accounts, some of them oral, some of them written down. And those Waitangi Tribunal reports are gold when you're working on something like this. When you're working with two opposing and contrasting versions, but you need to acknowledge both. The risk is that you're going to be bogged down, it's convoluted, it's hard to follow, and it could drag. Episode 4 of Te Rauparaha ke Wareware deals with the infamous rivalry and ongoing utu between Ngāti Toa and Ngāi Tahu over a decade. There's one section about the murder of Ngāti Toa, Ariki, Te Pehi, and 20 other rangatira. We had two very well-respected Ngāi Tahu historians, Te Mairito and my whananga Helen Brown, telling a very convincing story. And I'd say not entirely one-sidedly. Me as Ngāi Tahu, I was okay with it. But Ross as Ngāti Toa and Ngāi Tahu was adamant and quite correct in saying that we needed the Ngāti Toa side in there. So it took a lot of puzzling out in the micro timeline, but with a well-paced flip back and forth, we made it work.
So, I mean, these are all just editorial discussions. We have journalistic backgrounds. That's nothing new. We have to abide by the same rules that we abide by as journalists, you know, objectivity, accuracy, fairness, balance over time, as we always have to say, balance over time. You don't have to be balanced in every single piece of work you do. Fairness is, I think, the one that's most important to me, that you just need to make sure that you have given everybody a chance to have a say. And that's something which you sort of have to keep checking yourself on. And that's something that's really helpful working not by yourself and in a team, so that you can have an editor, you can have a mate, you can have someone look at this and see where are the holes, what might I have stuffed up. Yeah.
We're running out of time, so I think we should move on to talking about sound effects, but perhaps we can play your Victor Penny clip.
Oh yeah. This was a fun one to do.
I think this is a brilliant piece of writing from Will. It really sets the scene in a really present tense, and you can also hear great sound effects and music.
Out front is a huge garage with a flat in the second story. And even though it's late, there's still the glow of electric lights flickering out the windows and between the cracks in the door. Inside, a man's hunched over a workbench. He's short but powerfully built with a bull chest and an intense expression. His name is Victor Penny. Tonight, Victor Penny is all alone in the garage, hunched over his latest invention. It's an electronic device, a bunch of wires and tubes connected to an antenna. Victor leans back and stretches. He fishes a cigarette out of his pocket and takes a match from the packet on his desk. He flips a switch. Victor Penny stares at his desk in disbelief. Seemingly out of nowhere, his packet of matches has burst into flames.
So yeah, that's another example of, accentuating these curves in your story, trying to build up that drama with sound effects. I think it's also a thing you've got to try and make your sound effects a bit satisfying. Like the sort of like rain on a tin roof thing is something that's kind of cozy and pleasant to listen to. You sort of punctuate that with a big explosion. You've got to wake your audience up every 10 minutes or so with a big bang. We won't do that all to you now. And you're trying to do, it's just classic theatre of the mind stuff, things that's been done, back to Orson Welles. These are not new techniques. What is great is that there's new ways of getting them. There's a lot of YouTube channels out there that have royalty-free sound effects, and you can just download them and use them. You're totally free to do so. I get a lot of my sound effects that way. It's actually doing this is super iterative. You put sound effects in, you take them out, you think you've got too much, and then by the end of it, sometimes you listen to the finished project and you just go, I wish I've used that one bit of musket fire way too many times, and people are going to hear it for the 5th time and they're going to be sick of it. But then you also don't know whether that's just you, because by this time you've listened to this project about 20 or 30 times and you are absolutely sick of it.
Yeah, I think those sound effects, it's really important not to be too on the nose about it as well. We definitely made a conscious decision not to use any sound effects of electric shocks in the lake. Voice actors are another thing that's quite hard to get right. And Will, do you want to talk to that a little bit?
I've had multiple complaints that one particular voice actor, who shall remain nameless, has an accent which is racist against white people, because he uses such a plummy old English accent. It's tricky to get these things right. You want to have a little bit of fun with it sometimes. You don't want to be disrespectful. One complaint I did get one time, which is something that I should have checked, is that I had voiced up someone with this nameless voice actor in a very upper class English accent, and he was in fact Scottish. And a descendant got in touch to say, my great-grandfather would be rolling in his grave to be presented as an upper-class Englishman. So you do have to be careful about these things. But at the same time, you want to have a good bit of fun. You want to keep the audience entertained. It's all part of it.
For Te Rauparaha, we had a lot of moving parts. We had Ross's script, passages of the book in Te Reo Māori, Ross's quick translations, interviewees, sound effects, music. It was a lot. And for those book passages, we needed someone who could not only act, but also read slightly archaic Reo Māori. It was a bonus that the actor that we found, Toa Waka, was also descended from some of the Ngāti Toa rangatira the podcast was about. So I'm going to play you a clip from the end of the fighting between Ngāti Toa and Ngāi Tahu. Ngāti Toa have come across to Te Waipounamu to hunt, but Ngāi Tahu war party attack.
They paddle furiously to get away from the enemy, but it's a terrifying situation. The force of the wind and waves keeps driving their waka back into the shore, and waves are washing over them. The Ngāi Tahu tohunga are on shore shouting karakia to make the wind rise to gale force, while Te Rauparaha is in his waka, reciting karakia to calm the wind and shouting encouragement to his kaihoi. And then the wind turns to the south, and Ngāti Toa are able to hoist their sails and sail away. Despite all odds, Te Rauparaha has lived to fight another day.
The last thing to go into the podcast is music. Coming from a music background myself, often the first thing I ask is, what's the soundtrack? I think the main thing to know about podcast soundtracks is that they're supposed to be more emotionally neutral than film soundtracks. And I've been lucky enough to sometimes commission these soundtracks from talented local composers. And the main feedback I give them is, can you make it more boring? Of course, it's not a hard and fast rule, but it's a pretty well-established style. I usually ask the composer for about 10 cues that fit different moods between reflective, quirky, dark, but not too dark, kinetic, something that moves the action along or builds momentum, and some drones. And sometimes all you need is a layer of warm, deep synth just to add a little gravity to what people are saying. And I'm going to play you a little example of something where I've taken just a little stem of what the composer has given me just to illustrate a little better what she's saying. This is Leonie McEnroe from The Lake talking about being a 15-year-old in solitary confinement.
A nurse came in every day and injected me. I have never known aloneness and abandonment like that. I knew in those hours and nights and days that there was no one, not one person that cared about me. And that nearly broke my spirit.
Leonie has the best emotional breaths and pauses, so we kept all of those. And then I was thinking about John Cage's experiments in soundproof chambers and his finding that there was no such thing as silence. He describes the high-pitched squeal of his nervous system and the beating of his heart and the sound of his breathing. So that's what we were going for there. We better wrap up, Will.
Yeah, we thought we were going to have tons of time for questions, but we actually talked all the way through.
One question online while we're waiting for more from the audience. Sarah Johnson asks, can you talk a little about the use of archival audio in podcasts and compromises a producer has to make sometimes? Speakers not succinct enough, audio quality, etc.
So that would be Sarah, formerly of, look, archival audio is amazing. And sometimes you find the perfect thing. Like we had that a little bit of archival before from the soldier who'd actually participated in the Surafend massacre. That was just such an amazing thing to find. And you actually get to hear him talking about, there's no substitute to hearing people talk in their own words from a long time ago. Archival material is tricky, mostly when it comes down to cost.
It is so expensive. It's $25 per second if you get it from RNZ and aren't working there. It's $35, I think, for audio from TVNZ. So you have to factor that into your budget.
Yeah. I mean, poor quality of archival sound is something that an audience will forgive you for. It's the budget that really is that really kills it for archival audio for us. It would be lovely if it were all free, but unfortunately it's not. Aaron.
Yeah, sorry, Aaron here. So I'm asking a question I probably know the answer to, but for audience's benefit. Kirsten, did you want to just talk a little bit about episode 4, where we had the worst of the worst material and the decision around how we handled that? And just one other question I was interested in, and I don't know if we actually struck this in the lake, but I think, well, you mentioned something around just the sources and the conflicting versions of reality, particularly with Lake Alice and the journalism I've done. You hear the survivor story and then you see the documents, which, excuse my French, are bullshit. But that is the official version. And you have the victims telling you something quite diametrically different. How do you manage that? But yes, episode 4.
Yeah, so episode 4 was the worst of the worst abuse, that we sectioned it off because we didn't want to re-traumatize or traumatize anybody, anyone listening. So we made the decision to put that in its own episode, and it didn't. Yeah, if you had the stomach for it, you could listen to it and get that full extent of the trauma that they endured, but you didn't have to listen to it if you didn't want to. As far as those discrepancies, I mean, I remember we had one guy, Vernon, who said that he was admitted to Lake Alice as a 10-year-old in 1968. We couldn't verify that at all. I mean, that was 4 years before the adolescent unit at Lake Alice was actually opened. So it would have been a great story to put in there, but we couldn't verify it anyway. But I think that it was really a survivor-led story, and we did give those guys, and a lot of them did have great paperwork, you know, a lot of them, what they said was backed up in their medical files, in their welfare files.
I mean, it's totally case by case, right? Like we've got, I can't really talk too much about it because it's an episode that's still to be released, but one, it's not a big deal, but we've got like someone telling us, we've got an auctioneer telling us they sold a certain thing to a particular person. We've talked to that particular person and said they absolutely didn't. All you can do is just give those two things and say, we tried to get to the bottom of this, we couldn't figure it out. And I mean, dealing with situations like that, I haven't had to deal with a situation that difficult where you actually don't believe one of your sources. It's just one of those things where you have to talk to editors about fairness, balance, accuracy, whether you're covered legally for defamation, all kinds of tricky stuff like that, which I know you've had to deal with plenty. Yeah. I think we had a question over here.
Oh, look, thanks for that. The whole thing is great. Just want to pick up on the question before last about archiving. You're producing these podcasts for 20-25 people, but I'm interested in what happens in 2050 when people will look back on these as little bits of evidence themselves. So when you're constructing them and when you're making them, is it wholly based around the immediate audience, or have you got an eye to the future, how this thing's going to stack up in 20 years' time? Because, and the secondary question to that is, you know, how well archived are the works that you were doing? Because I'd hate to think of them just sort of fading away into cyberspace.
Well, I can speak to one thing, which is that I'm very glad that the Aotearoa History Show is archived, because I managed to plug the hard drive which had it on it into the wrong power socket, and all of the magic smoke escaped, along with our entire archive of that show. But luckily, Ngāi Tahu Sound and Vision had a version of it. So our stuff is questionably well archived sometimes, but sometimes we have to be helped out. As far as thinking for the future, yeah, sometimes I think about that. Sometimes I look back on stuff that I made earlier in my career and I'm like, I don't think I'd do it that way these days. That might just be part of getting older and a bit more experienced, very slightly more experienced. Yeah, I don't know what you think about that.
I know that podcasts do have a long tail. What I mean by that is, you know, they can, you know, pop back up in the charts for years after you've released them. And, you know, somebody tells somebody about it. And so it just keeps going. I never think 20 years into the future. I have trouble with 2 weeks into the future.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, I do hang on to raw interviews. That is definitely something that I do, and maybe I'll talk about who I should give them to. But yeah, you do have to try and think about making things a bit timeless. Like for example, when we were doing the Surafend episode, the most recent conflict in Gaza had just broken out, and we sort of thought, oh, should we mention that context? And we decided not to, because we thought by the time this podcast breaks out, that may be over, which is not the case. But you do have to think of your audience, far in the future, who are just like, what are you talking about? You're referring to something that's in the news at the moment, which has been out of the news for 10 years now. I think some of my early Black Sheep episodes refer to the property price boom of the sort of 2010s, which is sort of not relevant anymore in the same way it was just then. So you do have to be a little bit careful with these things. Yeah.